Hello, my name is Holly Smith. The date is November 11th, 2020. We're working with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and today I'm interviewing
Lillian Guerra.
Thank you for being here with me, Dr. Guerra.
Sure, this is a great joy. I rarely get asked to be interviewed about myself or my experiences. It's usually Cuba and only Cuba, sometimes Puerto Rico. So this is refreshing.
You've written a lot of books on Cuba and Puerto Rico, right?
That's why, I think.
Well, let's get into the life history then instead of the Cuba and Puerto Rico books. Start out with when and where were you born?
Oh, so we're doing a life history. Okay. I thought we were talking about St. Patrick's or being Catholic or something. I was born in New York City, January 20th, 1971. I was born in Queens. And my parents had moved there my mother in 1964 and my father in 1965.
Did you have any siblings in your family?
Yes, my sister Lucy, who was, approximately 18 months older than I was. She was born in July 17th, 1969.
And was your family Catholic?
Yes, although we were a family that was quite divided in terms of I'm sorry about the dinging. And I actually don't know how to turn that off without ruining the audio on my computer. We were quite divided, I would say, by my parents' class difference. And so as a result, my father was very typical of peasantries in Cuba, where he had been baptized, but other than that, had almost no contact with Catholicism at all. And it's a part out of choice, out of his parents' choice and out of tradition. His parents were also quite divided by class, and that distinction is very important to determining, your access in Latin America in general, but certainly in Cuba, rural Cuba. They were peasants from Mina del Rio to the church. And so my mother was very much the opposite. I mean, her father was a peasant, but from a different region of Cuba, and came from a long line of very, very Catholic Canary Islanders. And so her mother, who was not an immigrant to Cuba, her oldest ancestor had come in the early 1500s. And so she was part of this, my grandmother on my mother's side, very established kind of aristocracy in Cuba until the end of the 19th century. And so my mother's Catholicism was very interesting because it was deeply, deeply rooted, deeply felt, but from two very different classes, and from this very different, aristocrat immigrant kind of combination. And so we were raised as Catholics by my mother, and almost, I don't want to say fascistically so, because that's an exaggeration. My poor mother is not a fascist, but my mother was very, very strict in ways that she isn't today. I mean, she was almost, I think, fearful that because my father was not Catholic and almost ignorant of the faith in all ways, that if she allowed any slippage, in the rules or in the dogma and the doctrine, that somehow we were going to end up not believing. And so I don't recall missing church, until I got to I guess when I was a freshman in college. I had never missed Mass. I mean, not on a holy day of obligation, not on a Sunday, not on days where most people don't go, like they don't go on New Year's Day. A lot of people don't go on New Year's Day. We would go on New Year's Day. We would also go on New Year's Eve. I mean, sometimes, frankly, I remember occasions where we didn't go on New Year's Eve because of the snow, but it was incredible. It was a very tense, that was a very important part of my identity when I was young.
So you said your father, he's from Cuba, and he was part of what was considered like the peasantry class?
Yeah, my father had a very unusually high degree of education, but his dad was an illiterate tobacco farmer in Cuba. His father had also so my grandfather on my father's side also had the burden of being an orphan. And that is really important. If you're poor and both your parents die, you're kind of screwed, regardless of who they might have been. You really, especially if you are not part of, urban society. So my grandfather, my father's father, and his brother were both orphans. And nonetheless, they grew up illiterate because they had, no way really of surviving if it weren't for the patronage of the local tobacco planter. So my grandfather on my dad's side worked from the time he was 4 years old in tobacco. And then when he was 18, his patron, the guy who was the owner of this plantation, his name was Manuel Sanchez, gave him effectively like money that he had saved that had been what he should have paid this child from the time he was 4 to the time he was 18, so that he could do something with it. And so Agustin Guerra, my grandfather, bought a small chunk of land, not very much. It's about the equivalent of 44 acres. My great uncle, Santiago, bought a little store in Herradura, Cuba, which is, both of these places are out in Pinar del Rio, far western province. But that makes you a peasant, you're a peasant. And my uncle Santiago, my granduncle Santiago, had a much higher bit of education because he owned a store. He had been able to write and to read. But that wasn't true of my grandfather. So my dad, was a product of that man. And then his wife, my grandmother, who was a mulata, which is very singularly important. Her father had been a Spaniard who left the country and had 5 daughters. And when he left the country, he left each one of his daughters enough money basically to be a dowry, for them to be able to go out and find a man and get married. And they were all half black, half white. And what's interesting about them is that almost none of them got married. All of them did something with their money, this little bit of money they had. And my grandmother became a school teacher. She graduated from one of the very best normal schools in Cuba. That's what they call teacher training programs back then. So Aurora Almiral creates her one-room schoolhouse right near this guy's farm, my grandfather's farm. And the two of them married in 1926, I believe. And so she educated generations and generations of peasants in this region, and did not retire until 1963. And she had up to 100 people in her classroom. Kids went to school when they could, they had to work a lot. So you had, 18-year-olds who were still in 4th grade. And you had 5-year-olds who were in kindergarten. And she managed, and everybody says so, who remembers her and who told me this, that she was an extraordinary teacher. So my dad was one of 3 sons. He was the oldest, and he was a product of that marriage. And he was very committed to being like the only person probably he had ever met whom he admired and whom he thought he could imitate. And that was the local doctor, the town mayor, Pedro Diaz. And so the town closest to this farm and to the school was a town called Puerta de Golpe. And, he was the mayor of this town. And my dad knew him when he was young because he broke his arm and he set his arm. And my dad decided he was going to be a doctor after that. So, that was very difficult, just as it is in any small town, to be the kid who stands out, who wants to, thinks he's uppity, who thinks he's going to be better than the rest of us, and go to college and all this kind of stuff, and reads a lot. And he had no support from his dad, from my grandfather in that. I think the only one who supported him was his mother, the teacher, who, for all that she was sort of underclass because of her color, was admired over time by the local peasantry. And there's more to say there. I could go on and on. Obviously I've done a lot of research on this, and really not of my own doing. I had a lot of people who would just grab me, in Pinar del Rio, and stop me and say I looked identical to my grandmother and I must be her family. And then they would sit me down and tell me for as long as they possibly could all about her and about my family. And then I had the great luck of being able to go to Cuba at a time when my grandparents had died, but my uncles were still alive. And so my father's brothers and their families are very intimate to this story too. I know a lot as a result of that, the kind of facts, you know. But anyway, so that's the result that my father is the result of that relationship. And he was very rural in his way of being. I mean, the man never learned how to appropriately eat, you know, at a fancy restaurant, and he didn't care. You know, and my mother, on the other hand, was somebody who always kind of rejected, in part because of her Catholicism, rejected the standards of her class. And because of her own father, who was a peasant and whose family was still very peasant, you know, they were still farming, and they were still quite poor. And he was the only one who made it out of his family. So my mother never had the same standards that the girls she went to school with had about the kind of man you would marry. And I think that, you know, and that relationship was very, very, very bad for a lot of it. You know, they were married 34 years, but I don't think it was bad at all those first 10 years. I think the period of time in which they were immigrants and we were born and all of that was probably the best part of their lives, you know, 1961 till, you know, the early 70s. Despite all of this shit, right? There's the revolution, there's having to leave the country. Your life is in danger. You leave everything behind, living in a Red Cross camp in Spain. I mean, you know, Franco is the dictator in Spain. I mean, it wasn't like it was easy, but in part, their relationship, I think, was very strong. They made it.
So when was your mother born? You know?
My mother was born in 1938. And my father was born in I think it was 1933. Yeah.
And she came over around the time that the Spanish Revolution was happening?
My mother and my father left Cuba in 1964.
Oh, okay.
You know, 5 years after the fall of the dictator and the rise of the revolutionary state.
So, did they tell you any stories about what it was like to first come to America from Cuba?
Absolutely. Your audio is not very good. I don't know if it's affecting mine, but you sound like very metallic. Yes. So, you know, there's so many stories there. It's hard to pick one. It was very difficult to leave in 1964. By then, you know, the vast majority of the wealthy and the elite had left. You know, the ones that were very conservative and pro-Batista and pro-dictatorship had left in 59. And then when the revolution adopts communism, then you get this whole other immigration of very wealthy people. But most of the middle class, like my parents, stay. And in part, it's because a lot of them had a very hard time believing that the government was going to adopt communism. And there's much more to be said there. You know, I mean, obviously I've spent a lot of my career writing about that and teaching about that. But my parents, you know, they had a very, very strained relationship with the revolution and its goals, the government's goals as of 1961, which is, you know, the big year. I mean, that's the year the United States invades at the Bay of Pigs with the mercenary army, as they were called in Cuba. And then, you know, but my mother worked at the National Bank at the time. And my father was at the university, and he had been a university student under Batista, and he recognized the signs of authoritarianism. And the vast majority of university students, like my father, who had suffered the terror of Batista, knew that what Batista had wanted to do at the university was politicize it. He wanted the faculty and their classes to support his form of rule and his form of economy. And so much so that, in fact, the faculty voted, and the students, which had a role, and like, you know, the United States universities, students in Latin America had fought since the early 20th century to be equal players in governing decisions. So there was this giant organization of students. They voted to close the university in 1956. And it doesn't reopen until 1960. And when it does, it basically adopts the same kinds of policies, except this time you have to support the revolution, and unconditionally. You're supposed to be a member of a militia. You're supposed to, believe and support the kind of discourse, which is increasingly radical. And my dad was somebody who had to be reckoned with because he was a peasant, and he knew how you needed to grow some tobacco, and he knew that a lot of these ways of state ownership were not going to work. And he also knew that that the state, once the government begins to dictate literally by law what peasants can grow, that just isn't going to happen, that you're going to get rebellion. So both of them were highly disaffected. And my father had basically convinced, because it had been a long time since he had been in medical school. He only had one semester left when the university closed in 1956. And so my father had, that's really tragic, right? But he knew that if he got his degree, that he would basically be selling his soul to the devil, in the sense that no longer would he be able to be a doctor as he had wanted to be. And that was very true. I mean, you had, as of 1960, if you were a medical student, you had to take a pledge of loyalty to the revolution. And that means that you took that pledge of loyalty instead of the Hippocratic oath, right? So that means that, you're not swearing that you will not do harm to the patient. You're effectively swearing that if the government tells you that this patient does not deserve care, that you cannot give him care or her care. So this is really this is the linchpin of why my dad decided to withdraw from pursuing his degree. And my mother, even more tragically, she in 1956 was in the third year of her doctorate in math and physics at the University of Havana. She entered the university when she was 16 years old, barely 16. She had just turned 16. She had turned 16 in August. And she would have been the first female in the history of Cuba to achieve a doctorate in math and physics. And she was the #1 student in her class. So to become a secretary, which is what she ended up having to do, devastated her, and, in 1961, when they both realized where this government is going, they wanted to leave, but they didn't have any way to leave. They didn't. And so the make a long story short, it really came about because my mother had worked at this bank in Cuba, and the entire floor of her bank, the international division of her bank, my mother spoke perfect English, or very close to perfect English. They had all left, and they were living in New York. And there's this woman, literally the only person of color that she had gone to school with in an all-white Christian Catholic school, Escuela Teresiana, Teresita, looks around one day and she's like, shit, where's Luisa? Is the only one who's not here. And so every Friday she made a general announcement. She's a mulata, green eyes, and she was ridiculously rich, really rich. And so that always gave her a pass socially in Cuba, because she could get away with murder. So when they're all in New York, she passes the hat every Friday. Everybody has to give to Luisa's airline tickets. And probably the best part of that story is how much they cost, because I found that out years later, and there were $960 each. Can you imagine this in 1964? And at $960, and actually she collected the money in 63. So my parents, she called Cuba, which is also quite hell, in order to gain my mother's approval. That she was like, do you want to leave? Like, why are you still there? And my mother said, well, how are we going to go? What are we going to do? And she said, well, I'll get you the money. And there's much more I can tell you there, but Teresita was really the key. She got them, almost $2,000 in airline tickets. And then my parents, they got visas to leave to Spain. So it was the Spanish government that awarded them the visas. The guy that in part enabled that was this old little man who was had been Cuba's cultural attaché to Spain in the 1950s, very famous poet laureate of Cuba. And he used his diplomatic pouch to help former brilliant University of Havana students escape. And so he would help them, right? And he maintained, because he was so famous, his name was Chacón y Calvo, the last name, Jose Maria Chacón y Calvo. he maintained his diplomatic status under Fidel. So Fidel never found out about this. But he had this huge house in Madrid that and he had, all kinds of ability, right? So he helped them get their visas. They were supposed to only get one visa. At the time, the Spanish government was only giving one at a time, not a couple. And they took this oath that if they didn't leave together, they wouldn't leave at all. So my mother, who was very devoted to St. Jude, the saint of impossible causes, this is one of the miracles in our family, attributes the fact that they had taken. Okay, try not to get emotional. They had taken this oath, and then, the guy shows up at the door as a revolutionary militiaman with the visas, and he had two of them. And I mean, it was stunning. So that's how they were able to leave. And they had a very hard time in Spain at the time that you left. Men were only allowed 3 changes of clothes. That's the only thing you could bring out of Cuba. Women were allowed somewhat the equivalent, but they were allowed more underwear. They were not allowed coats. And they left February 1964. So before you left, the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, which is the surveillance organization that had been started in September of 1960, they existed by then on every block in Cuba. Membership wasn't mandatory yet. It would become mandatory by 1968. But these were people who were your neighbors, and they were the deputies of the state. So before you left, the Ministry of the Interior, the guys who were at the top, would have this division, this squad of sederistas, of miembros del Comité de Defensa de la Revolución, go to your house and do an inventory. And so every little thing in your house did not belong to you. And the day before your flights, if something was gone or broken, they could decide to take your tickets from you and prevent you from leaving. Or you had to pay for it so that it could be replaced. And it was famous, the story that when they, in our family, that when they came to do the inventory again, to make sure nothing had been, quote, stolen from the revolution, there was a tiny little espresso cup that had a handle that was broken off. And my mother was required to pay for a new one. So then when you get to the airport, you had a strip search, which for my mother was, extraordinary, because she had never probably seen herself naked until the night before her wedding. That's what happened in Cuba with, a certain class of women. And so she had to undergo that. And my father was even more humiliated from the way that he told that story, because, the guy who was in charge of the search, in his case, the body search, was a former friend of his from medical school at the University of Havana, a miliciano, who was also of a wealthy class. I mean, this is also the case that many people, families were divided, and a lot of, younger people from the middle class kept with the revolution until, for many, it was too late to leave, till they woke up and smelled the coffee about the policies and what life under communism was going to be like. But so this was stunning. And the assertion, the belief was that you were carrying, and this is what the milicianos were instructed, that you were potentially carrying the wealth of the revolution in your body. So that meant orifices like your vaginal area or your anus, diamonds, money. And so they would search that area. And then they would, in my father's case, he was so, as a doctor too, to have somebody who's a medical student, of course, carry out the operation of the anal rectal searches. But then after they did that, it made you jump up and down, and they searched you again. So they eventually got on the plane, they left, and there's a great ending to the story of the jumping up and down. Because there were these 2 little old men who were standing with my dad, in this line of 3 guys, right, naked, jumping up and down, and they allowed you to keep your shoes on. And these guys were very concerned about their shoes. And, they weren't that great. They were nice. They were Florsheim shoes, which is a very famous label of leather handmade shoes. Very thick heel. If you've ever seen a Florsheim shoe, you would know. After this, my father, when he could, only exclusively bought Florsheim shoes, right? But so these two little old guys, when they got off the plane in Madrid, they had $5,000 in layers in their Florsheim heels and their shoes and the sole of the shoe. They get off the plane, they give my dad, like $50. My dad $50 for each one of them, gave him $50 because they're like elated. Everybody else is crying and weeping and, devastated. Oh, we have a frozen screen. Okay. And these two old men are just overjoyed, right? Because they made it with their money. And it was US dollars, obviously. So anyway, there's more to say. I mean, they went through hell, and I think these little micro histories of the experience kind of reveal more than trying to gloss it all over, just to leave, what they endured. And you can imagine the impact on their families, because they were the only two in their families who had left at that point.
When they came to America, is my audio sounds better than it did?
Your audio sounds like a robot again, but that's okay. If I can understand you, we're okay.
I want to attempt to see if my Wi-Fi is the problem, but I don't know how that might affect the recording.
That's fine. I mean, you don't have to stop. We can go on.
To my future self who's transcribing this, I'm very sorry for the sound of my voice. So when your family came to America, did they come straight to New York?
They did, because Teresita, the woman who had gotten the airline tickets, she and her mom lived in a basement apartment in Queens, and she worked at Chemical Bank. And she was saving money. New York was expensive then as it is today. But my mother could live with them, she said, as long as she wanted, until my dad came. So my mother, who had never gotten along with Teresita, by the way, in school, they'd gone to high school, and gone to, and they'd gone to this Teresian academy. There's a philosophy to the Teresians that I should tell you about. But it's Saint Teresa de Avila. So it's the Spanish doctor of the church. And, one of her things is you have to have a mission in life. It's all very serious, and it's all about being a woman, but being an intellectual, right? And Teresita was just, a nightmare. She had been a terrible student. She was like a brat. She said bad words. People were convinced she wasn't a virgin, and this is the woman who saves my mother, right? And then they lived together for a year. And my mom got a job at Chemical Bank. Teresita had a better job. She was like the secretary, because her English was very, very good. And she was the secretary of like the executive, who was their boss, the boss of the whole floor. And she later married him. And so my mother and Teresita lived there for a year together. My father, meanwhile, had his transcript smuggled out of Cuba by Jose Maria Chacón y Calvo. And, there's also sort of a twist of fate in terms of that, because, he could apply to the University of Madrid. They had a very medieval system of examination. He was going there with essentially only missing one semester of his medical career. So he had to show, on the one hand, he had to pass this exam, which was oral, and it lasted several hours. And if you've ever seen, the guys who taught at Oxford in the 1970s, they were wearing big black togas, the kind of things we wear to graduation. And in the 1960s, under Franco's Spain, it was even worse in Spain. They had these huge hats, and very intimidating, very, very medieval. So that was on the one hand, probably step two of the problem. Step one was just being able to get their attention, and get the University of Madrid to recognize the validity of his credits. So he was helped along in that respect because, again, St. Jude, my mother was at Mass, and they had been in this refugee Red Cross camp having what they called arroz con cucarachas, rice with cockroaches, for lunch. And my father was standing in front of a Spanish restaurant, probably like a lunch place, right? And they had all these spectacular breads on display in the glass window in the front. And he was standing there just like, like his mouth watering, looking at all these people behind the lunch counter eating these giant sandwiches. And this man walks up to him and he says, "You must be Cuban." And my father turns around and says, "Yes, how do you know?" And the guy says, "Well, come on in. I'll take you in. And you could tell me about your life and who you are, and I'll buy you a sandwich." So my father sits down, tells him the whole story. And the guy turns out to be the Minister of Education. My mother's down the street, praying to St. Jude that like the University of Madrid will take my father seriously. And there's my dad having lunch with the Minister of Education of Spain. Franco, Spain. So, it's interesting. My dad, would never have claimed a Black identity, but he looked, when he was young in particular, he looked very mulatto, which was very, 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 very problematic in Spain. He had green eyes, but, in the United States, they called him a nigger with green eyes. He had green eyes. He had a very wide nose. And he was tan. He was, kind of a brown color with very, very dark, wavy hair. And so the Minister of Education told him his only problem was going to be the color of his skin. And my father had like no idea what he was talking about. And he said, whatever you do, try to get any more sun, right? So my dad, ended up spending, my mother goes to the United States, works for 6 months. My dad finishes at the University of Madrid. He manages to graduate, and then he came to the United States. And then he found work mostly as a hospital orderly or cleaning floors in hospitals in New York. He then was promoted to like working in a lab based on his credentials. But my father could speak no English, none. He's very peasant. In that respect, he had no access to that kind of an education, or that even access to. My mother had, for instance, as a teenager, gone to Miami with her great aunts when she turned 15. Or not her great aunts, my great aunts, Chacha and Olga. But my father, my father had never been to the United States, let alone have any education in English. So he had gone to country schools, and so he didn't know any English. And lo and behold, once again, you have this divine intervention. In this case, by Jews. He presented himself for training at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. Where he was at that point just cleaning floors, and he had this interview with these Jewish doctors. And at the time, Mount Sinai had no doctors who weren't Jewish. Everybody was Jewish, all of them. And if you go there today, you'll note that it's still very prominent as a Jewish hospital, because on Fridays, Shabbat, the elevator stops on every floor. And that's as true of the hospital as it is of the medical school. And that is because if you don't know this, as a Jew, you're not supposed to make fire. You're not supposed to take a car. You're not supposed to drive. You're not supposed to intentionally turn on your lights, turn off your lights. You can't do anything like that. It's making fire, and that's a violation of one of the laws of Judaism. And if you're a conservative Jew or an Orthodox Jew, you don't do this. So it's a very, very, very Jewish hospital, especially in 1966 at that point. And my father spoke almost no English, and he basically couldn't answer any questions. And this guy says to him, Dr. Sean Holtz, who is a gynecologist and an obstetrician, and who would later deliver me. It was a panel. I don't know how many doctors on this panel. There's several doctors. And he said to him, Dr. Guerra, we're going to give you a shot here. We're going to admit you to the training program. And the hardest thing you're going to have in the first few weeks is figuring out when they're calling you over the intercom, right? Because nobody could pronounce your damn name, right? So, my dad got his training at Mount Sinai in internal medicine, which is very rigorous. And then he went on to Long Island Jewish and got some training in cardiology. And we moved to Kansas, as the story goes in my family, in large part because my dad had always wanted to cumplir con la misión de servir a los campesinos. You know, he wanted to serve the peasants, and he would translate guajiro, which is the Cuban word for peasant, as peasant. And so he didn't ask like, where are the farmers? You know, he asked where are the peasants. And all these Jews who are from New York would tell him, oh, that's Kansas. You got to go to Kansas. That's where all the peasants live. You can go serve those people. And so the first job that came up, and you know, and at the hospital, they would put up these little jobs on a bulletin board. It's not like today, you know. So there was this little newspaper clipping that was on the bulletin board from Marion, Kansas, that said that the town of Marion, which was only like 2,300 people, invited people, doctors, to go to Marion, and the town would pay for your house for a whole year. And they would make, you know, they would accommodate you. They bring you there, have you have an interview, have your family visit the town. And they would, you know, all of that was in this little announcement. And so my dad was like, well, that's where we're going. So, you know, we ended up moving to Marion, Kansas in 1973. And we stayed there until 1984.
It sounds like, pardon the car going by. Sounds like when your parents were in Spain, they faced quite a bit of racism. Were there any instances of that when they came over to America?
You know, my father probably would not say that that was true, other than, you know, the story that he would tell me, because he never wanted to be seen as Black. And that was because when he came to the United States, particularly in New York, he was not judged to be white at all. And in Cuba, he hadn't been either, but his father was white, right? And his mother was this respectable mulata, you know, but it was like something that you didn't talk about. You're supposed to be ashamed of this, right? And so this kind of secret, open secret about his non-whiteness just collapsed in the context of the United States. My mother in Spain endured the most brutal, disgusting kinds of sexual harassment from her employer. And that's one of the reasons she wanted to get the hell out of there, and came to New York as soon as she possibly could. Standards of comportment in the United States were quite different, you know, towards respectable white women. Well, women like my mother, who was a beautiful woman, who was very white, much whiter than I am, you know, had the features too of a kind of classic, you know, Spanish beauty. And that helped her immensely, you know, and, you know, I think it helped her in Kansas too. You know, my mother, because she was much more of an intellectual than my father, and for reasons having to do with their very different emotional character. Also, my mother's willingness to, you know, she had a huge conscience, right, and has transformed, you know, as a person politically. From the time I was a child, where she was like a supporter of Nixon, to, you know, being the supporter of Obama, and you know, and now, you know, it's obviously you know, filled out the couldn't wait to get her ballot so she could vote for every damn Democrat she could find, you know. But my father never had that evolution at all. So my mother is somebody who's very interesting to talk to about this, because she was always very aware of how, you know, people in the town of Marion treated my dad, you know, and how they saw him. And he just pretended, or he either pretended, he just did not recognize that he was being treated differently or as an inferior, unless it was overt. And so the elite of Marion, you know, because everybody has an elite in this country, and the elite of Marion, you know, included the other doctor, who everybody in the town wanted to retire. He apparently was a jerk. His name was Dr. Inzi. And I've actually, that's how we pronounce it in my family. I don't even know how you spell that, because we would just say Dr. Inzi, but it's Inzi. He was a racist in every way you could see, and that was apparent. So my father, being a very good doctor, very committed doctor, I think he earned the love and respect of the farming community, and almost every person in Marion was a farmer. Very few people. There was only one lawyer in the town, and then there was Dr. Enzi. And the elite was tiny, but they had their Marion Country Club, and we were not invited to be members. My mother was relieved because at the time she found out from her neighbor Janice that there were swingers in that country club. You know what a swinger is?
I've heard many different connotations with it.
Well, they would have these parties where you would go into the country club and they had a fish bowl at the entrance, and you put your keys in, the keys to your house or your car. And then, some days the women got to pick, other days the men got to pick, and they would pick the keys, and then you were having sex with that person, whoever's keys you got. Can you imagine this? My mother was thrilled to not be invited to this shit, and then to be honest, like, our neighbors were really interested. We had the greatest neighbors because they were so aware and very protective, of my parents and of us. They were very aware of a lot of the shit that was happening, and I think they often shielded us from the worst of the of the attitudes. But I know that that one of the reasons we did end up leaving Kansas was in part because, Marion got itself a new doctor. Dr. Enzi finally retired. And then they recruited this guy, Dr. Martin, who was half as qualified as my father. He was very young. And suddenly, he was a white guy. And there was this sudden kind of rejection that my father was feeling. I don't think he would ever admitted it at the time, but it definitely played a role in why we ended up going to the very place he said he would never go to, which is South Florida. So we ended up moving to South Florida, and I hated Miami. I mean, I still hate Miami. I know Miami very well, but he ended up, living the rest of his life there. He died in 2014 in August. And what a horror that place was, in the 80s, especially.
You elaborate a little bit on what it was like in South Florida at the time?
Yeah, I mean, Miami was the place we would never have gone to because any Cuban who could live elsewhere knew that Miami was a hotbed of terrorism against other Cubans, perpetrated by these communities and groups, associations of Cubans who, were supposedly the patriots, and they targeted anyone who was presumed to be a liberal or presumed to not support them. And so my uncle on my mother's side was also a doctor, and he had moved to Miami. And we went to Miami every summer. And so we were there and witnesses in the 1970s to this extreme violence that began to erupt 73, 74, 75, 78 of Cuban exile organizations like Alpha 66 or Omega 7 that would call up doctors like my uncle and kind of shake you down. They would say that they were collecting money for the liberation of Cuba. They were connected to the CIA, had been trained by the CIA in their vast majority in the 1960s. And I can say that as a historian who's now writing a book that includes this material. But they had, and who's also written about this before, but they were no longer officially sanctioned to carry out incursions against Cuba. They didn't have the support of the US government as of really 1965 to do that. But it's not until like the mid 70s, 74 in particular, where the Nixon administration is actually making overtures to a peaceful coexistence, as he would do with China, as he would do with Romania. And this is a major threat to the Cuban exile elite of Miami, who wants to get their stuff back and who wants revenge. And so one of their tactics was to collect money by, asking for donations. And if you refused, you were targeting yourself. You were declaring that you weren't a patriot. And so my uncle gave regular contributions to these organizations. You had to. And so that was one of the principal reasons that we didn't want to go there. There were many more to not go there, but the exile politics was extremely intense, and And it was very, very obvious, too, that the American government did not know what to do about that. I mean, they bombed the airport, they bombed, the bombings were extraordinary, 74 to 76 in particular, but they continued. And there was bombings in 83. Bombs were going off, not, I want to say constantly, but virtually constantly. And they were going off against businesses, et cetera, whose owners wanted to establish some kind of connection with Cuba. And so under Carter, when that happens in 1978, we get finally some kind of diplomatic representation in Cuba for the first time since 1960. We get this U.S. interest section. Anybody who supported that had their business bombed. So probably the most famous case is Padron Cigars, and the cigar factory. His cigar factory was bombed 4 times. He ended up having to move to Tampa, and the death threats were pretty intense. And so, it was a horror. And that's the main reason that we didn't want to go to Miami. My father wanted to flee this kind of this intense political situation. And we ended up being right in the middle of it. We got there in the early 80s. And it was, I could stand it. I couldn't stand it because I had never lived in an authoritarian regime in my life. And that's what Miami was. And many people would say that that's what's returning to now with this, the Trumpists of Hialeah, as we call them very disdainfully. But, you can't have a discussion, you can't have a debate, you can't ask a question because you're a communist. And so that was the social scene. All the people that I knew who were teenagers and Cuban didn't want to know anything about Cuba. They didn't want to talk Spanish. They didn't want to speak Spanish. They didn't want to get involved because that was an explosion that you were catalyzing an explosion if you were going to bring something like that up. So it was very apolitical, and I had never lived under those circumstances. I had lived in Kansas where you could talk about anything.
How old were you when your family went to South Florida?
I was in 8th grade, so I was 14. I was really like 13. I was 13, between 13 and 14.
And how long did you stay in Miami?
Well, we went to Gulliver Academy first because Ransom Everglades didn't have enough room. And my parents had, in their way, just wanted to send us to the best school, right? And so the best school was going to be Ransom Everglades or Gulliver Academy. And they found that out, before we got there. So Gulliver, I really wish that I had stayed at Gulliver. Gulliver was an excellent school, and it was not of the super rich. There's a difference between the aristocrats and the upper middle class, people who make hundreds of thousands of dollars because they're doctors or they're surgeons, and people who have old money. And Ransom is an old money school. And it is, when I got there in 9th grade, first it was 72% Jewish. It was secular. It's still largely Jewish, but most importantly, there were about 470 students. Less than 12 were non-white. Carlos Watson, Eugene Williams, Mariana Valdez Fowley, myself, my sister, David Clark. I'm counting them, right? I know that there were 6 of us who were not white people. And in that group, the people who were Black, like Carlos, his parents were community college professor, Jamaican American. Eugene was from Carroll City. Mariana was a very unusual person because her dad ended up decades later being, mayor of Coral Gables. And she came from a very aristocratic Cuban family and a Cuban background. But she had a very distant relationship with a lot of the bullshit at this school. But it was extraordinary. It was very white. It was really rich, and it was very into drugs. It was a place where if you went to a party, and I was somebody who was horrified by that. I was in ninth grade, and I had no interest in these kids who were supposed to be popular. The kids who were supposed to be popular, they all were cocaine addicts, or they were taking cocaine, they were experimenting with LSD. What made you cool was that you had enough money to buy these drugs. And of course, your parents, you went to the parking lot, and the parking lot was just filled with Mercedes and BMWs, and they were all owned by these 16 and 17-year-olds. So I made myself no friends because I founded a chapter of Students Against Driving Drunk. Gives you no dates, none. I had some interesting comrades in that, among them Mariana and others. There was that. There was also, I also ended up founding an organization that was not a national organization, but one specific to Ransom that was called the Student Parent. I think it was called the Student Parent Forum on Against Drugs. And, and I ended up discovering that one of the kids who was a member of my little board of this Student Parent Forum on Drugs was a major drug dealer at the school. He sold marijuana, and he was 1 year younger than I was. I was a sophomore at the time. He was a freshman. And I found that out because he left a book in the college. They got a psychology counselor for the school, in part to deal with the drug problem. And she had a very small office, and he left one of his books in there. And I went to return it to him, and out of the book dropped a photograph, a 4x6 of him with a 100-pound sack of marijuana. And then I took it straight to the dean's office, silly me, thinking that the administration would do something about this. And of course they don't, because they exist on money. And those parents have a lot of say because they fund that place, and it's to the tune of millions of dollars. So, there was nothing that ever happened to him as a result of this. I mean, my eyes were opened in so many ways when I was at that place to just how filthy and disgusting, the elite of this society can be, even when that elite is peopled by teenagers, and how their parents didn't care. Their parents were, a lot of the kids were raising themselves. You go to a party, there were no parents around. There were maids. And the maids would ensconce themselves in the little guest houses. Some of them, had drivers and butlers. And then you would have 100 kids there, and they'd all be doing drugs. I mean, it was astonishing. But the most disgusting part was to see how students, just because they were rich, could manipulate the environment for others, and disdain and degrade others, who were not interested in those things, or were smarter than they were, or some way a threat. So my whole goal was to get out. But, I'll tell you one more story, because I have, Ransom is to this day, exists on it. If you go there today, they have so much money. They have a giant Olympic-sized pool that's replaced their other giant Olympic-sized pool. They look like a college campus. And they're very proud of the few people that, in fact, are the stars, who were the intellectual stars, like Carlos Watson or Rachel Feinstein, who never gave a shit about any of her comrades at that school and became an artist and was always getting demerits because she would refuse to conform to uniform and wear like candy striped tights and her hair up in a bun like this. I mean, there were a lot of very, very smart kids, population maybe 5% of the school, who were really the creme de la creme and have remained so, of U.S. society. But you ever heard of a journalist named Diane Sawyer? Well, she had a nephew, and this was at kind of the height of her fame because she had been on CBS for a long time and 60 Minutes. And so Diane Sawyer's nephew had gotten kicked out of like Andover Academy and one other school for drug use. And there he was admitted at Ransom. And this was a kid who was in all of my AP Spanish classes and would always disrupt every single class, yelling and belittling the teacher. She was Puerto Rican. Her name was Dr. LaRousse. I mean, I had never in my life encountered this. And then I would go and complain. And the teacher herself was terrified of losing her job, that if she complained about Diane Sawyer's nephew, that she would somehow get fired. I mean, so these kinds of things, when you're a teenager, they radicalize you. I mean, this kind of sense of injustice was extraordinary to me. So the end of the story is that I had the greatest teachers in the world. They were the best part of Ransom. Many of them are still there. I'm not retired, but some of them have. Mr. Peach, a history teacher, was there for 38 years. He was such a good teacher and so radical and so unwilling to take anybody's bullshit that when he retired, they didn't even have a party for him. I mean, others who were willing to kiss the feet of the children of the elite have had, libraries named after them. But not Mr. Peach. And Jeffrey Peach was an extraordinary teacher. He now lives in Gainesville, by the way. And there are many, Dr. LaRousse, Dr. Crabtree, who was a biology professor or teacher. So these are people who were just amazing. Mr. Wilson. Also a history teacher. So I ended up, when I was a sophomore, encountering this kid who was in the breezeway of Ransom, whose name was David. And he was a sophomore and just really smart at math. And he had gotten into MIT. And I'm like, how do you get into MIT? You're like 15, And he said, and I kid you not, and David, who never gave a shit, also one of these people who never gave a shit about anything. And he said, Lily, I bet you could do it. I don't think MIT. I go, no. I hated math. I mean, I was taking my calculus and everything, so I would never have to take another calculus class again. But he said, I bet you could do it. You just need the support of the school, right? And so there are only a certain number of colleges that will admit you if you don't have a high school degree, but you can apply when you're a junior. So he wasn't a sophomore, rather. He was a junior. I was a sophomore. And he had just gotten in early admission to MIT, junior year. It means he could skip senior year and get the hell out of Ransom, right? So that was my sole purpose, getting out of Ransom, right? And I went to see that very day the associate dean. And I'm going to remember his daughter's name was Nancy Eckert, his last name, Mr. Eckert. So I went to see him and I told him I wanted to go to college. And he was like, well, so where do you want to go? And I told him the whole story, and I don't know what else I told him. And he said, I think you could probably do it. You need to narrow it down. And so at that point, I went home. I talked to my grandfather on my mother's side, Chichi, the peasant, who had somebody. He gave me $1,500. And my parents were fine with this. I said, I'm going to go do a college tour. And I did. I visited, it was hard to do it back then. You had to contact the admissions office. They had people who were ambassadors for their colleges. And I created this whole little safari for myself. And I decided I want to apply to Dartmouth. And so at the time, Williams College, Dartmouth, and Harvard were the only three that would take you if you didn't have a high school degree. But you had to apply early admission and you couldn't apply to more than one. You had to apply to only one. So if you wanted to go to Harvard, you couldn't apply to Dartmouth or Williams. So it was great. So I went up there. Carlos Watson was a freshman at Harvard, the black guy. And he was a very close friend of mine. So I stayed with him. He was at Pennypacker dorm. And I didn't like Harvard at all. Everybody was playing solitaire. Nobody was like talking politics. I wanted to have debate. And I loved Dartmouth. And everybody at Williams, for all that it was a great school, was drunk. I didn't need more of that. So, so I applied to Dartmouth. I got in early admission. I got the hell out of Miami. I got out of Ransom. And I finally got to get back to this kind of, for all that everybody might see the opposite to be true, but the kind of intellectual environment that I had grown up in Kansas with which I had grown up in Kansas, which is, a place where you could ask questions, where people had, I also lived in Kansas at a time that my teachers had all survived the Dust Bowl. They had all had, a husband or a father or a brother who had been in World War II. It was a time, and it was the 70s. So it was a highly politicized moment. And most people were not Republican, not in my town at all. My mother and father thought they were all communists. So it was terrific. And then I went to Dartmouth, which was a very conservative college. But, from my father's perspective, it was also a communist institution. They made me into a historian. I was reading Che Guevara my freshman year. So that's the whole story. But I don't know if you have any interest in the intensity of my high school years, but they were extremely formative, and I've never talked about them. I've certainly never been recorded speaking of them, and I have to say that it was. I had never had a kind of solidarity with people who were not wealthy. Like, you know, and I want to say, I don't want to say I have a class consciousness because I wasn't working class. You know, and I'd worked at McDonald's and I was a college or a, what do you call it, a day camp counselor. But these things don't make you working class, you know. Nonetheless, I developed this intense knowledge of how this super wealthy elite operated and what its values were and how they transmitted those values to their kids, how they had a kind of, you know, they walked on water, you know, and they had very little, like I started to be treated better when I got into Dartmouth, early admission, by my peers at that school. Only because they were like, well, shit, this little bitch, you know, how did she do this? You know, of course, I've been working my ass off, right? Taking things very seriously, writing papers, 26-page papers on Sylvia Plath, you know. So it was also very disconcerting to see that people who have all the resources in the world would care so little about knowledge.
I noticed that you were telling about your family around the country, there's eagerness to do the right thing by others, like your father, your to work with as a tree kids, and you in high school started to drunk driving.
Your audio is getting worse.
Oh no. Can you hear me at this volume?
I can hear you at this volume, yes.
So your father, he was very eager to work with working class kids, and then when you got to high school, you noticed a lot of drug problem. You started an initiative for stop driving your peers. Do you where do you think this like drive for justice comes from for you, your family?
Drive for justice, where I get that from?
Yeah.
You know, I would definitely attribute that to the Cuban upbringing. You know, I was very curious about U.S. history, and I was encouraged to ask my teachers, even if my father thought they were communists. You know, he had great respect for the teachers. You know, I never heard him say, or even though they didn't agree, you know, with their viewpoints, but I never heard him or my mother say that I should not believe what I wanted to believe, you know, as long as I had the evidence for it. And I spent a lot of my teenage years arguing with my father about U.S. intervention in Latin America, in Miami, you know, under the Reagan administration, and then certainly in the early years of my time at college. But in Kansas, that was a place where the injustice too that my own peers had experienced as poor people at the margins of society, that was obvious as well. I mean, when you go to school in a town that only has 2,300 people and you start kindergarten, you only have, you know, 20 kids in your class. I had 22 kids in my class. And everybody who went to school together, you know, they all graduated from high school, Marion High School. The only one who wasn't there was me, you know, and yet I still get invited back to their you know, their reunions. I mean, I just got invited to the 30-year reunion. So among those kids, you had, you know, I'm not going to mention their names because they're still living, and they don't need their dirty clothes, you know, hung out for everyone to see. But you know, there was a boy in my let's call him Steve, who was very, you know, he behaved badly and he didn't have to. He was such a smart kid. You know, he was getting C's and D's and, you know, as of second grade. And it was because his father was a policeman who was beating his mother, you know, and it wasn't until my own dad, who knew the mother was a nurse, my own dad and others gave her sanctuary and threatened this guy by going to the sheriff, you know, that Steve and his mother got a divorce and Steve was safe. And then he, you know, was able to do better. But then there were kids, like there was a Native American family in Marion where the mom was probably shunned. Who knows why she was there? Her reservation was far away. And she had twins who were both a product of alcohol abuse during her pregnancy. Annie and Janie. Annie and Janie were in my class, both of them, and Annie was deeply affected. She probably had an IQ of no higher than 80, maybe 70. Janie was almost normal, is how I would put it. But these kids, how did I come to discover that they had just intense poverty? Well, my mother did not know how to make pancakes. And, when you asked her to make pancakes, she'd buy this horrible Bisquick mix, put water in there. And our neighbors, were amazing making pancakes. They'd have some buttermilk, and they had, and so every time my mother also buy fake maple syrup, and Betty Lau and Dodie Cork or Dodie Cork's mom, whatever, all the neighbors would, they would invite us over so we'd have real pancakes with real maple syrup. So the greatest thing for me was having pancakes, and I rarely had them. And I was sitting there talking to Janie, in part because she often didn't have anybody to talk to, and there was no lunchroom until you got to third grade. So kindergarten, first grade, second grade, we're all at this school called Mount Corby, and they didn't have a cafeteria, so everybody had to bring their food. And I would bring all of this food that I thought was horrible, ding dongs. Sometimes my mother would put a bottle of Pepsi Cola in my bag, expensive food. This stuff was expensive back then, and everybody had homemade food. And so we would often talk about food. And I also had some weird stuff, like I love sardines. Cubans eat sardines. I had no compunction with eating sardines. And plus, nobody made fun of me because I was the Cuban, and, they're just weird, right? So I would have my sardines and my crackers and my Pepsi Cola and my ding dong, and, nothing like peanut butter and jelly. And I remember talking to Janie one day about what she had eaten for dinner. And she told me that she always ate pancakes. And of course, I thought that was the greatest thing in the world. Like, oh my God, you eat pancakes every day? And then she told me that she ate pancakes almost every day. Very rarely did she eat anything else. And I went right home and I told my mother this. My mother started crying. How poor that family was. And then who knows in what conditions they found themselves. Annie could not pass second grade. Janie got C's and D's. Janie was in my class. And we had Mrs. Jeffries, second grade. And then, these people who were really poor like that, they would disappear. So, Janie and Annie disappeared for like 2 years, and then boom, they're back in fourth grade. And you never really knew, because families, people in small towns also, they don't talk to kids about stuff. They don't want people, they gossip, but they don't want their children to gossip. So I never got the story. And then my mother detested gossip, so she never found out either. She wouldn't ask any questions. But I was always struck by, like, if you only have 2,300 people in this town, how could anybody be hungry? What the hell is wrong with that? But it's very hard to I can't even imagine what I would do if I were in that situation. But I think I would have gone and knocked on that woman's door.
As you were going from place to place and seeing all this injustice happening in Kansas and Miami, was this something that you discussed often at church?
In our church in Marion, St. Joseph's, we had an Irish priest, Irish American. He was born in Ireland. His entire family was in Ireland. Father Path. And, he did his best, is the best way to put it. I think he served more than 20 years. I think it was 29 years in that parish. Very lonely. There were hardly any Catholics in this town. There were 29 denominations of Protestants, however, and in a town of 2,300 people. So all the tiny, tiny little fragmented Christian community. And then the Catholics, there were 200 Catholics, but most of them didn't live in the town of Marion. They would drive in from the farms outside, some is really far away because, Kansas only has 1 million people. And excuse me. And so you have huge extensions between, and then there were towns that were entirely devoted to one faith. So our next door town was Mennonite, Hillsborough. If you weren't Mennonite, you weren't welcome in Hillsborough. So our Catholic community, was mostly drawing from people outside of Marion. And that meant that, frankly, I don't know that I was old enough to engage with some of the youth, right? The teenagers and whatnot. But I found it really boring to go to Mass. I remember my mother wanting me to listen to what Father Path was saying. And, I had a hard time grasping with the relevance. And what I did instead, and I remember doing it kind of deliberately when I was about 7, was to actually sit there and reread the 3 readings we have. We always have an Old Testament reading. We have, the second reading is usually a letter from Paul. And then we have a gospel reading. And, there's a lot of radicalism in the gospel. And there's a lot, the more you read, and the liturgical calendar repeats itself. There's 3 cycles, A, B, C. And so, every 3 years you return to A, right? And that means that every 3 years you repeat reading these sections of the Bible in a certain way. And let me tell you, if you're going to Mass all the time, you really learn that text. And I have to say it was I got a lot out of that. I got a lot out of the gospel. I started realizing how, and I didn't say it because I wasn't quite sure I could until I was in 7th grade, how revolutionary Jesus was. I mean, his very first sermon, which is the Sermon on the Mount, right? That's the very first act that the first, moment of public engagement and evangelization that he does is to give this extraordinarily radical speech, right? In which he says, the meek shall inherit the earth, all of the Beatitudes, right? And what does the crowd try to do? They try to kill him. They try to throw him over a cliff, and Matthew, who is a tax collector, and that's actually one of the things that I got from Father Path is he would, every so often he would insert this sort of historical fact, like who this person was, or what the historical context was. And then I would go, oh. So when you think about how Matthew's a tax collector, I mean, there's so much to be said about, how he would have been perceived by other people. But then you also think this is a guy who's all about numbers. So he's got a lot of exactness in what he's writing, and I started to really believe that he had, this is a made up. There's a lot of overlap among the Gospels, but what's really important there is what's missing. There's no misogyny. There's no racism. There's misogyny in St. Paul. There's misogyny in Timothy, where Timothy says, that in order for the Christians to look good, we all have to be sober. And women need to be under the control of their husbands, right? And Paul says women have to cover their heads and obey their husbands and all that shit. But that's not in the Gospels. I mean, it's kind of stunning that it's not there, right? Because of the time period, the context, etc. And then the roles that women play are very pivotal in the story of Jesus. They're really radical roles. So for all that my mother kept trying to drum into my head these extremely reactionary views, her own life did not show that to be true. She might have wanted me to believe that, we're supposed to, and I would have debates with her all the time, or I would have fights with her all the time about this stuff. She might have wanted me to believe these very conservative views of women, that somehow we are inferior creatures, that we could never be, I lost you. No, that we could never be priests. And I just wasn't buying it. And the reason that I wasn't buying it is that my evidence was coming from the Gospels. And I didn't need more than that. I just needed to be quiet, which is very hard to do when you're a child or you're a young person. I needed to stop fighting with somebody who's never going to agree with me. And now once I did stop fighting, when I was in my early 20s, I stopped having those arguments, et cetera. Now, where are we? My mother is like this, I mean, she doesn't believe in abortion, and I don't necessarily do either. But, on the other hand, give me a break. My mother is a radical woman, and she keeps, she wants women to be priests. She believes homosexuals should get married. I mean, it's pretty crazy stuff, right? She believes in contraception. I mean, the very things that she had taught me the opposite of. And the only way you can explain that is her own faith has led her through great moments of crisis. And then she has been able to bring it back to, like, what did Jesus say when he is tested again and again about what are the commandments? And he says, love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. And the only other one he says is love your neighbor as yourself. Those two. Nothing else matters. None of the dietary laws, forget everything else is contingent upon those two. And so that once you start thinking that, then it really does change you. And I think it took me a long time to become humble before that word, because, I wanted to be secular. I never, ever was an atheist. I never was an agnostic. I always believed in God, but I didn't believe in the sacraments, and I didn't believe that I had to do certain things. And now I've come to believe that I should do them, that I don't think that others are going to be judged by the same measure. And most of the church doesn't either. I mean, those that I know, our own priest, we are each judged by God according to what has been given to us, and what our conditions are, and what, God's plan for us is. And we are no one to judge anyone else.
As you traveled from like church to church, city to city, were there a lot of views like your mother's in Catholicism that you struggled with?
Most of the time, Catholics don't talk about what they think. They don't. And it's fear, because, 80% of Catholics believe in contraception. And contraception was okay until 1968, when the Pope suddenly said it was wrong. A lot of American Catholics don't believe that the Pope has it right. They don't believe they have to follow what the Pope says. People who are very vocal about their Catholicism and their beliefs also violate one of the teachings of Jesus, which is that, and it's in the gospel where he talks about how many of the wealthy Jews of his community, they would go out, and when they would give charity on the days that they're supposed to give charity, they would take this big ram's horn and they would pay somebody to go blow this horn. That's where we get that phrase from, go blow your horn, right? So the blowing of the horn to make sure that everybody sees that this rich man is giving away money, right? And in fact, he teaches us that you're supposed to do the opposite. Nobody's supposed to know, right? It's supposed to be between you and God. If it's true and sincere, it's between you and God and nobody else. And if it's about you, then it's not about God. And so that is all. I think I trust that that's one of the reasons that Catholics in the Kansas context, and I would also include Wichita there, because I spent a lot of time in Wichita churches, in the context of Miami Lakes, which is where I went to church in Florida, in New Hampshire, in Wisconsin, in Maine, and Connecticut. People don't impose. They don't want to have open conversations about the doctrine of the church. And it's not just because many of them don't know what exactly it is, but because they don't want to know. And then there are many people who know, and they don't want to impose their views on others, and they don't want to pick a fight. They don't want to have somebody tell them that they're wrong. They don't want to have somebody, and there are a lot of people, and I'm telling you, a lot of women who believe that it's none of your business. None of your goddamn business. What I believe. And to be honest, the people that I know who are very close to the issue of abortion here in Gainesville, women who work with those with women who are pregnant and are thinking about having an abortion. For instance, there's an ecumenical means right between among different faiths. There's an ecumenical support center right in front of the library on University Avenue. and right near the Catholic Church. And there you have Catholic nurses, you have nuns, you have plenty of Lutherans, you got Methodists, and a lot of kids from University of Florida go there because they have an STD and they're terrified and they don't know what to do. Then you have a lot of them who go there because they want contraception, but mostly it's the STDs. And then there are women who go because they're pregnant. And the vast majority of them will get an abortion. And, according to the friends I have who work in this capacity as volunteers, 90% of them are white, they're sorority girls, and they're wealthy. And they never expected this to happen to them. All they want to do is figure out, how to get rid of it. But they have a great understanding that they're going to kill a life. And it's only when you're pregnant that you really can understand this. Now, nationally, it's a very different context, right? Most women who seek abortions already have children. And certainly in some communities, it's poor women who are African-American, who are Latina. These are not 18-year-olds, sorority girls. That's not the image, and it shouldn't be. But here it is. And one of the things that I think will be the future for the church with regard to this issue is the sense that effectively, whatever the law is, that's not our business. Our business is God's business. And Jesus said, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And so that means that, if you are really called to be a Catholic, then you don't pick up the first stone. And I think a lot of Catholic women, whether they say it or not, believe that in the end, it's about your body and your God. And you will live with the consequences of what you do. But, whatever choice you make, it is no one's to judge you. And this is why, we don't, in general, have Catholics, seeing the abortion issue as primary in their voting patterns. It only is among those, again, who are the vocal Catholics. And I literally think that's 20% of the church, maybe. And in some places, those of us, we're sort of the silent majority that is also not really interested. A lot of us are not interested in taking political positions because we see that as something we do in this world because we have to, and we engage in this world, and we impact as much as we can this world based on the truths that we believe that we hold. But there's also a reality that you don't get. It's not black and white. You don't get to say, well, I'm not going to vote for Biden because he supports abortion rights. Sorry, that's not how you calculate, how any citizen should calculate who they are voting for. But, I'm trying to reduce it to an example, but the way you live your life is how you're supposed to be Christian. And that you have to, you emulate, you follow in the example, right?
So this attitude among Catholics that really stresses the importance of one's personal relationship with God and God's judgment of one's personal decisions. Is that something that is carried over that you've seen in St. Patrick's Church?
Yes. It really is. I think what Father Lawrence, and I don't want to speak for him. I would actually say what I have learned from him. And so whatever he thinks is separate potentially from what I think about what he thinks, right? But what I have learned from him and from my own process is that, it's not about God judging you. It's about you developing a relationship with God. And developing a relationship with God means that you have to think about, and ideally you would think about everything you do in relationship to God because God created you. And so if you pray several times a day, or you are in a moment where you could be angry, and you choose not to be, that's a moment where you are in touch with God, because God is very slow to anger. And God is not going to get angry over some person just cut him off in traffic, So this kind of consciousness alleviates a great burden because this, what I think propels us often to act in hateful and despicable ways that damage ourselves as much as we damage others, is the self. It's the desire to be God, to be powerful, to actually be significant, to feel that we really, really as individuals, can control others, ourselves, the environment. And when in fact, when we are in best control is when we yield the control to God, when we surrender to God. And, I find that to be very true in my own writing, for instance, where I get freaked out every time I have to write something. And this is, what I do for a living. But when I pray just in the moment of panic, or in the moment where it's just total procrastination, then I realize this is not about me, just surrender. And it's, the phrase, it's not a big deal, doesn't capture it. It's about doing something that's not for your own ego, and it's not about how you feel, or it's about something bigger than yourself. And that means that if you're doing whatever you might be doing, if you do so in connection with the spirit, in connection with the community that you are serving, or the person you're with, or the beings that surround you, whether they be plants or whatever, whenever you do something where you are not focused on yourself, but in connection with the rest, that's when you're with God. And it is so hard to be with God, rarely with God. Even those who devote themselves to God, they make rituals of their lives. They pray a certain number of times a day, like nuns do, right? And in part because the actual practice of prayer, and I wouldn't call it a ritual, I'd call it an exercise, but the kind of scheduling of one's life around God forces one into a different level of consciousness. And Buddhists do that too, but when you're not a nun, and you're not a Buddhist, well, then you have this, then what are you gonna do? You have to figure that out, right? And everybody can figure it out differently. I do think that I have changed tremendously in my life and been saved multiple times from death by the intervention of God. And otherwise I wouldn't be able to explain it, that I think is very, very important. What I want to say is recognizing God in your life, that this didn't just happen by accident, that this wasn't a coincidence, that this was a sign, that we are very reluctant to do. That is what we are most reluctant to do. No, it was the medicine that cured the child in a moment when, he might have died. I was saved, from a very precarious situation in India, by, the intervention of this man who arrived. No. In fact, that man arrived in part because, God willed it. And it is, as I say, it's very hard. It's hard for us to admit that there are miracles. It's hard for us to admit which ones, but who cares about the ones outside of ourselves? We have signs of the existence of a greater being or greater beings in this universe. And when we refuse to recognize them, we're denying in a big way why we're here. Even if we don't have an answer to that question, we get closer to the answer by recognizing that we are not here just for ourselves. There's something bigger, and we are little tiny ants in this universe. So when we recognize that and we see the intervention of creation in our lives as individuals, then I think we are recognizing God in our lives, and it is transformative, can't be denied. And the more you recognize it, the more you realize, and it changes you.
When did you come to Gainesville first?
I got here in the summer of 2010.
And what was it that drew you to the city?
Well, I had been at Yale for 6.5 years, and there's a long story there that I won't go into, but University of Florida had a position in Caribbean history, and they were offering my then husband a job that he would never have had at Yale. and they were offering to train him in this position at the library so that he could have this job that was much more about how he had been educated. He was Cuban. He is Cuban. And we had a little boy who had who's now 11, but who had been born very traumatically. And the year and a half before I arrived here, I had, spent going to physical therapy, 4 hours to 5 hours a week, giving him physical therapy, 2 to 3 hours, sometimes a day in my house. It was a very intense period, and his, there's no doubt that not only his survival, but his recovery was miraculous. So much so that his, the head of infant neuropsychology at Yale, who's this old English doctor named Dr. Jeffrey Miller, called him a scientific anomaly. He loved seeing him because in his field, you don't have children who are dead at birth, who get resuscitated, 5 minutes later, who then have another significant insult to the brain, which is that he had a seizure about an hour and a half later, and then, is paralyzed on half of his body and isn't blind, isn't deaf, doesn't have an IQ below average. Elias was a miracle, and there wasn't one doctor who didn't know that. And it was an extraordinary thing to experience. But I also thought, we lived in a tiny apartment in New Haven. To really have any kind of a better life for my child, to have a backyard, a front yard, anything like that, I needed to go to a different location, or I was going to have to wait, until 10 years. To be able to get out of a tiny apartment and have a modest kind of a living situation. And I wanted Elias to have, everything he could have, and grow up in the kind of conditions that I had grown up with in Kansas. This isn't farmland, but it's close. You can ride your bike down the street. Nobody's gonna, New Haven is like one of the biggest crime rates in the whole state of Connecticut. There are like 2 mob families there. It's, New Haven isn't just Yale. It's a very urban place. And so the whole idea too of moving here had a lot to do with that.
So when you came to Gainesville, what was it that drew you to St. Patrick's Church?
Oh, that's a very good question. I had been going for many years to St. Augustine Student Center, which is the university church. And they acquired, I shouldn't say this, I guess, but I might as well say it. They had gotten a new pastor who is the current pastor. And he is an ex-Marine. He's very conservative. And his conservatism comes across in sort of the disdain for the Spanish-speaking community in the church, his sort of dismissal of the Spanish-speaking mass, and then more importantly, in his lack of challenge to the parishioners in his homilies. This is Father David. He doesn't challenge. It's almost like a feel-good, party there. And not surprisingly, the homilies or the masses that he would give, were often the most attended by like the white sorority girls and the white fraternity boys. It was a very different cross-section of the university Catholic community than the other masses. And when I was there was a Father Tony who was Nigerian. That man was getting his PhD. He's now at the University of Pennsylvania. That priest challenges. He was an awesome priest. And it was exhilarating to be challenged by Father Tony. So what they ended up doing the year before I moved to St. Patrick's was they stopped telling people which priest was assigned to which mass, so as to prevent, these communities from forming around the priest. And I found that really hard. I would go into the office to find out when is it that Father Anthony and what Father Tony is giving. And so, I also had my child in Catholic education at St. Augustine. And they just didn't know how to run that. It was not good. It was not good. And they had a big chunk of the kids or a big chunk of the kids who were attending the catechism there, which was held on Sundays, after mass or between masses, were Spanish speaking, and their parents were just dirt poor Latin American immigrants who didn't speak any English. And, and so there was this very, very sharp divide between the parents, and they would have the kids go off to their catechism classes, and then they'd have the parents sitting there, and we were supposed to talk to each other about these different, concerns, and they would put us in these circles, and I would always go over to this group of, the Spanish speaking working class families, and they weren't accustomed to speaking in public ever. They were workers. They were here, picking fruit and vegetables. And there they were, kind of forced into this academic seminar style, situation. And it was very disturbing. And so even though they had a fully bilingual, Catholic education program for the children, I didn't find it offensive, but I found it really sad. And I felt like, you know what, I can't do anything here. I mean, that was the other thing that made me want to leave, is that I didn't feel like I had a role. It's a church where the people who are activists and the ones who are supposed to be the focus are the students, and they're only there for 4 years. And so somehow the kind of adult community is a shadow to that central community, which is ephemeral. It comes and goes. So there wasn't a real way to change, and I wasn't going to suddenly suggest that I could even take over. I'm not qualified. I mean, I'm not even that Catholic in the sense that, I got issues. I've been divorced, so I wasn't going to suggest that, but I wanted to help, and I just didn't see how I could help, and I didn't see how I could change things. And I need to be in a community where I can help. I have a role, whatever it might be. So St. Patrick's was extremely welcoming. It's also a very, very interesting community. It's very poor. It's got some wealthy people, but it's in its vast majority, I would describe them as lower middle class or working class. There are a lot of Latinos who take their kids to the catechism, but never would presume to get out of their cars, and go bother the teacher or something like that, of the religious education class, because, tienen como humildad, there's a very Latin American kind of respect for the authority of a teacher, or the authority of a priest, or the authority of a catechism teacher. And they were trying to disrupt that in ways that were very, very problematic culturally at St. Augustine. And then at St. Patrick, we haven't figured out how to deal with that yet, but there isn't a disruption. People get to be who they are. And there isn't a student community that's the focus and the priority. And you never get the sense that there's just one group of people at St. Patrick's who are the priority, or who are the center of attention or something. People are very humble, and those who are in leadership roles are among the most humble. So you don't know that they are leaders. You find that out because you keep seeing them. They're at everything. They organize everything. They're always wanting to help, and then you find out, oh, she's president of the parish council. Okay.
You said your son was, or you weren't very fond of the environment at the Catholic school at St. Augustine.
It was Catholic education classes. So it's not a school. It was just like the religious education classes on Sundays, the catechism.
Have you taken your son to do religious education at St. Patrick's?
Yes, I started him in religious education at St. Patrick's when he was in first grade. And then I ended up putting him into the school and taking him out of public school and putting him into St. Patrick's School. Religious reasons, really more for academic reasons, when he was in second grade. And he did his first communion in third grade. I mean, it was wonderful. The best pictures in this house are all of him and his, in his first communion outfits, because he had lots of but that was a wonderful day. And it was wonderful in large part because, he, to my surprise, Elias is not somebody who volunteers to do things. He doesn't want to have a public role. He out of nowhere told Father Lawrence that he wanted to be an altar server. And I was like, wow, like, dang, And, he loves going to mass. He loves being an altar server. He's been doing that since he was in 3rd grade. Oh, I think everybody's home now. We've been talking for way too long. Can you hang on? Well, we're at the tail end of my interview. I'm talking about you. Hi. Hi. Okay. What do you think? Can we wrap it up?
Yeah, well, I think we're getting there. If I have one final question, what is Catholic? We've said a lot about it, but if you could sum it up in however you feel is best, what does it mean to you to be a Catholic?
Well, I think what we talked about for a long time, this issue of justice and how do you achieve it. I learned that from being Catholic primarily, because I would never have been able to have this kind of consciousness as fully developed as I did as a child if I were sitting at home watching cartoons on Sunday. There was that, and there was the fact that the book, and we are a religion of the book, and that the elevation of the mind that comes from reading and from the gospel that I got as a child, that was very empowering to me. I didn't have a lot of sources of power. And I think that I felt a tremendous source of power when I could think on my own without my mother telling me or a priest telling me about what Jesus had said and how it applied to my life, or how it applied to the Vietnam War, or how it applied to race relations. And so, these concepts of equality that come from Christianity, that come from Jesus, they were central. And so when I say, what does it mean to be a Catholic? Like, I wouldn't really, I really wouldn't be a historian if it weren't for the fact, and a historian in the same way, if it weren't for the fact that when you are a Catholic and you are constantly, in dialogue with the sins and the crimes of the church, and you're aware of them, as well as its efforts to unite people, you realize, well, this is much bigger than I am. I mean, this is a 2,000-year-old institution. And then, you got a pope. I mean, we certainly have a pope now who has to deal with a lot of crap, 2,000 years of problems, right? And crimes and atrocities. And at the same time, we are not just, people in Gainesville or here in the United States. To be Catholic means that you have people all over the world who have something in common with you and who are connected to you. The African priest or the Nigerian priest or the priest in India or the nuns of India, with whom I worked at one point, they have something in common with you. And that is something, the word Catholic means universal. And that is something very important. We recognize the universality of humanity if we recognize what Jesus teaches us and what we should understand, which is that we are all the same and we do everything we can to be unequal. But that is not of God. That is of man. That is of humanity. So I think it's a sort of, at this point now that I'm almost 50 years old, it is sort of so interstitial. The Catholicism is so interstitial in my identity. And it is that it is impossible to separate it out and say, well, I'm Catholic because of these reasons. Well, I'm Catholic and, I am.
Well, is there any final thoughts you'd like to express before we wrap it up?
No, but this has been very thorough. I feel like I really need to put some powder on. Start sweating here, and I didn't put the AC on. But this was very good, very thorough. We covered a lot of difficult, painful ground, and I'm very pleased that I didn't burst into tears. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for interviewing with me today. I think that your story is a gift, and I feel honored to have taken part in your delivery of it. So thank you.
Thank you so much for asking me. I can't wait to see if you do anything with this in relationship to all the other stuff you've done in your class. Thank you. God bless you.
Bless.